you even get $50 million worth of MotoGP bikes and cars without anyone noticing? And it's allegedly connected to one man.
Make no mistake about it, Ryan Wedding is a modern-day iteration of Pablo Escobar.
An Olympic snowboarder turned fugitive. And one detail that's alleged in this case makes it a whole lot darker. But the real mystery is this: what bikes does he actually have? And why were they hidden like this?
But first, we need to understand how he got here.
Before any of this stash, Ryan Wedding was known for something completely different. He was a Canadian snowboarder. According to the FBI, he represented Canada in the 2002 Olympics in Salt Lake City. And that alone is an insane start to this story, which I can only imagine one day is going to be turned into a Netflix documentary. Because after finishing 24th in the 2002 Olympics, he didn't turn to coaching or media, but it's alleged that he pivoted into crime. The FBI describes him as wanted for allegedly running and participating in a transnational drug trafficking operation, moving large quantities of snow from Colombia through Mexico and Southern California into Canada and other locations. Now, all of these are just allegations, but the scale of what the authorities are describing is why he's one of the most wanted men in the world. Now, the FBI claim that he's allegedly living in Mexico right now under the protection of the Sinaloa cartel. And if you watch enough Netflix like me, you'll know exactly who those guys are. But this is where this story gets even darker. They announced a newly unsealed indictment connected to the January 2025 murder of a federal witness in Colombia, and authorities allege that Wedding ordered it. The US State Department also references the case and ties it to a reward for information leading to his arrest and/or conviction, which I believe is currently set at $15 million. So that's us up to speed on Ryan Wedding and how he got to this point. From snow in Salt Lake City to snow in Colombia, things have taken a massive change for him. Now, in all these allegations, there's also allegations that he stored his money in cryptocurrency and tried to hide it in various different ways. Now, if you've been following this case online, you'll know there was allegedly $40 million worth of motorbikes seized, but a month before that, there was also a 2002 Mercedes CLK GTR, which had been valued at $13 million and was one of only 6 in the entire world. Allegedly, that was also connected to Ryan Wedding. Now, a month later, they've now traced down what they think are his motorbikes. Which, if we forget about all the other backstory and everything else that we've just talked about so far, this collection of motorbikes is absolutely incredible. Any bike collector's dream, and I really want to get into some of the things that I've found in this collection.
We'll start with the bikes that are a little bit more common, and then we'll work all the way up to the crown jewels of Ryan Wedding's alleged collection. Now, before we get into this, I've studied this picture as hard as I possibly can. I've used a lot of my friends' help, and I have to give one shout out in particular to Rory Skinner, who races in British Superbikes and went through this bike by bike with me. Now, without seeing the bikes close up in person, we can't be 100% sure of our information, but this is our best guess at what bikes are sitting in this collection. At the bottom layer, it looks like a high-end collector garage. We think we can see a Hailwood 900 SS replica, a Paul Smart style Ducati 860 GT replica, there's a Ducati 851 road bike, and there's a very old school British classic, which I think is either a Brough or a Vincent. Now, please feel free to dive into the comments if you think I'm wrong or you think we've missed anything with this collection. Now, expensive? Absolutely. Would you be happy to have any of those in your garage? Yes. But does that make this whole thing suspicious? No. At this point, you wouldn't question how any of those bikes have got into this garage. This is just the kind of stuff a rich enthusiast would buy because it makes them feel like they own a bit of history. But then you hit layer 2. And it gets weirdly specific. Mixed into this, on the left-hand side, you can see a Rossi 125. But although at first glance you might think that was Rossi's early 125, the colours don't quite match the colours that he used to race in, so perhaps this is just an Aprilia RSW that's been painted up in some Valentino Rossi colours. But that's just the beginning. Then it escalates into some serious unicorn territory. At the front, you can see a Ducati Super Mono bike. I believe there was only 67 of these built, and they're a rare collector's item that don't come up very often. So the fact that he's got one of those sat at the front of the collection is impressive nonetheless. I think I can also see a Ducati TTF2. I think there's actually more than one of those in the collection. There's a Suzuki GSX-R 750RR and an 888 Ducati. Now, these aren't just I like bikes type of bikes. This is I'm collecting the rare stuff so I can brag about my collection type of bikes. If you've enjoyed this video so far, please hit subscribe because there's plenty more where these came from. Until you hit the next layer. Now, when I started delving through these bikes, I spotted a couple of those and I thought it's quite impressive. They're rare bikes to have in a collection. And even if you just had one of those, it would be an amazing feat to have that in your garage. Until you get to the next layer. Now, layer 3, it begins to look like a racing paddock. And it's where it turns from collector into race machinery. Now, as we said before, unless you're up close and looking at these bikes in person, looking at frames and stickers and all sorts of things on them, it's impossible to know 100% that these are the bikes I'm saying they are. However, this is our best guess at what we think they could be. So on the right hand side, I can see what looks like a Carl Fogarty World Superbike race bike. There's a Bostrom 998, there's two Scott Russell bikes, there's a bike from Akira Yanagawa, and there's an RC45 endurance bike. And when that's sitting in one place, you start asking the first serious question. How do you keep acquiring bikes like this without anyone noticing? Because now it's not just money, it's access to this industry. But then we climb again. Now layer 4, I'm going to call this the museum tier. These are bikes that are the sports DNA. It's where the Stash stops looking like a garage and starts looking like a museum. On the right hand side, there's a Ron Haslam Elf bike, which is one of the weirdest and most iconic engineering stories in racing. But the next spot, I have to give credit to Rory Skinner, as I hadn't even noticed this bike in the collection. Now, if it's what we think it is, behind this bike, you can just about make out the 19 of a Freddie Spencer 250. Now, that bike famously was the one where he won 2 championships in 1 year. And if that is that bike, that's absolutely incredible that that is in this workshop alone. But we don't stop there with the Grand Prix royalty. Now, alongside that, we think there's a Freddie Spencer 500 and Wayne Gardner's 87 NSR 500. Just next to that, there's an Agostini MV500 triple. Now, these are not just bikes, they're racing artifacts if they're the genuine ones. This is what you'd expect to see in the Honda Collection Hall in Japan or in rare, obscure museums around the world behind glass cases, not just in some vault in Mexico. Now, some of the trickier ones for me to pull out in here before we get to the real crown jewels were things like the bike with a number 8 on it. Now, with some research and digging, I think that is Ferrari's bike from around 1980. And it's only in this picture where you look at it side on, you can actually see and make out the fairings from the side. I got a little bit excited because Graziano Rossi also rode for that team, and I thought it was actually Rossi's dad's bike alongside some of these other bikes in there, which got me very giddy. But still, obscure and a random thing to have in this garage alongside everything else. And I forgot to mention earlier that I think there's a Kenny Roberts 250 snuck in here. I'm not sure if it's genuine or not, but that's what it looks like. But again, some of these bikes, without being there and seeing them in the flesh, it's impossible to tell whether that is the real bike or not. In my experience of the racing world, unless you wheel the bike out of Parc Fermé on a Sunday night after the final race of the year, it's always very difficult to know whether you've got the actual race bike or not. However, that will change in a second when we start getting into some of these other bikes that we can see in this warehouse. Which leads us into the top tier. Because to me, this is where it stops being a bit of a maybe and we're not sure if that is a genuine bike or not. And it starts actually being, how is this even possible? So now we hit what I would call the crown jewels. Because everything before this could perhaps be explained or put down to being a one-off bike that we see here or there. But modern MotoGP machinery is in a different category altogether. A lot of the modern MotoGP bikes, when they finish the season, are actually crushed because manufacturers don't want other manufacturers getting their hands on them, or they go into storage and they're locked away and they're not seen for a few years. It's very important. Yamaha, for example, don't get their hands on a Ducati so they could pull it apart and copy everything they're doing for the following year. We're a few years on from when some of these bikes that we can see here would have been raced. But I think perhaps if there was just one of these bikes or it was a bit of a one-off, then maybe you could explain it as a bike that had been copied or faked or I don't know. But the fact I'm about to show you some of the world's most iconic bikes, and I'll take you through each one in a second, it puts this past being if, buts and maybes. These have to be genuine MotoGP bikes that are sat in this warehouse, which is just incredible. So let's build up the story. We now have a Marc Marquez Moto 2 bike. That bike alone would be something special to behold. Marc Marquez has gone on to be one of the most successful MotoGP riders ever, and the fact that this bike is sat there is incredible. But then we get on to some of the most incredible things I think we've found within this museum. I just called it a museum. Mexico warehouse. On the top left-hand side of this picture, you can see a T2 on the front of this bike. Now, this is impossible for me to know 100%, but at the end of MotoGP seasons, sometimes test bikes would have a T on the front for test. And you can see this picture here of Troy Bayliss riding a bike with T1 on the front. So to me, this could perhaps be another test bike used by Ducati at the end of the season. I can't actually find any photos of one with a T2 on the front, but that's my best guess as what this is. Then again, it might not be that and they might just have put a T2 on the front. Me and Rory got incredibly excited when we saw this yellow Ducati in the front of the frame. Now, we got so excited because Rory had this wild guess that this was actually Mike Tyson's Ducati. And when we found the photo, we got incredibly giddy because we thought it actually was. Unfortunately, we noticed that this Ducati has a black Ducati on the tank and Mike Tyson's didn't, so we don't think it actually is Mike Tyson's Ducati. But then we get on to the MotoGP bikes. Now, this is where this collection just goes absolutely crazy. I can see quickly at the middle here that we've got two Andrea Iannone Ducatis. Now, those alone would be incredible masterpieces to have in your garage, but then we move on to the next set. From the front here on the picture of all the bikes, you can see Andrea Dovizioso bike on the left-hand side. And in one of the other photos, there was another Andrea Dovizioso bike, which at first glance, I just presumed it was the same bike. But when I looked, that actually proved that there was a second Andrea Dovizioso bike because they're different. Then I did the same thing for Lorenzo, because on the right-hand side, there's a Lorenzo bike there, and in this frame, there's another Lorenzo bike. And at first glance, they look like the same bike, until you take a closer look and you realize they're two different Jorge Lorenzo MotoGP bikes. Then I noticed this Capirossi bike, and it was only when I compared it to the second photo, I realized there was actually a second Capirossi bike as well. One Capirossi bike has white on the front and the other one didn't. I also cross-referenced that to Nicky Hayden because I wasn't sure if it was a 65 or a 69, but I've realised Nicky Hayden didn't actually use those colours, so it is two Capirossi bikes in the collection. Then we move on to not one, not two, but if you look further back in the collection, you can actually see a third Valentino Rossi MotoGP bike, which was made even more incredible by the fact that there's just a CRF 450 lent up against the side of it like a stand. Can you imagine having a Valentino Rossi bike in your garage and just leaning your motocross bike up against it? But after getting to the end of the bikes that I could see quite clearly, I stumbled across something even more incredible in the ones that you can't see as well, which I'll get to in a second. But before we do that, we need to understand exactly how they got their hands on these bikes in the first place. But the more research I've done and the more you dig into it, there's a very good chance that these bikes were bought in three different ways. Now, number one is at the end of the race season, depending on who the rider is or the relationship with the team, there's sometimes the opportunity for the rider to buy their own race bike at the end of the season. Sometimes, in rare cases where riders have won the championship, the manufacturer actually gifts them their motorcycle at the end of the year. That could be a possibility for something like the Ferrari bike that we saw. He could have maybe raced that bike during the year. It could have been his own race bike that he bought. And then at the end of the season, he bought that off the team or kept the bike. So the bike stays within the motorcycle industry and they know where the bike's gone. Later down the line, he might decide to just sell that bike privately, and that's one way that racing bikes enter the public domain. Now, the second way is direct from the manufacturer. Now, this tends to be something like a MotoGP bike that the manufacturer don't release to anyone to buy initially, as they don't want the other manufacturers copying them. Then 4 or 5 years later, there comes a point where the manufacturers still own that asset and they want to sell it on to make some money, or perhaps just get back some of the costs they've invested in the project. Now, these bikes, because they're so expensive, don't just enter the public domain like a normal motorcycle that'd be put up for sale in a shop. These bikes are privately sent out to investors or collectors or people with a lot of money that buy a lot of motorcycles from the manufacturer. So someone like Ducati, if they know they've got a list of customers that buy X amount of bikes a year and have a lot of money behind them, then they offer these motorcycles to them first. Obviously, there's not a lot of point in putting out a bike that's 600,000 euros to the general public if most people can't afford it in the first place. And then the third way, generally, is through auctions. Now, these might be auctions like Sotheby's or Bonhams, where they might be race bikes that were owned by a rider years ago, or it might be the manufacturer selling them through an auction. And that's where I managed to piece together a little bit of this puzzle. The first one on my list was Valentino Rossi's Ducati. Now, when you type that into Google, there are auction sites that come up with historic listings of this bike being at auction. So there's a very good chance that this bike was just bought at an auction by someone, and then later down the line, it was perhaps just sold to someone in Mexico or sold to someone in America. I also found this Agostini bike in an auction. This Ducati was also supposedly sold at auction. My good friend Jamie Morris found this exact bike at auction. And then at Sotheby's, there was also this Rossi bike. So there's a very good chance that these bikes just appeared at auction, someone bought them and then sold them on to this collection. Or perhaps he has his own buyer that goes around looking for these bikes. But one thing's for certain, whoever's sourcing the bikes for him knows what they're doing, because these aren't just any old motorbikes that have ended up in this warehouse. But that's when I stumbled across something that I think is even more exciting about this whole picture of this warehouse. Now, towards the back of the collection, it isn't like they're just all rust buckets sat there. There's a Valentino Rossi bike mixed in the middle of all of that. So to me, there could be all manner of motorbikes still sat around that Valentino Rossi bike. Now when you start delving into these auction sites, there's all sorts of Ducatis that have come up for sale over the years. But the seat units and the front fairings, when you look at these bikes, look a lot like Ducati 998s, 1098s and 1198s. Now I've taken this picture, I've upscaled it in Photoshop, I've highlighted everything, I've tried to change the colours slightly to saturate things more so we could see exactly what was going on. I've sent it back and forth with Rory Skinner and my brother, and all of these are just wild stabs in the dark. But when I really studied this seat unit, it appears to be a number 1 on the seat. Now this might be a little bit of a long shot and wishful thinking, but I'm excited about this whole collection and I want to try and understand what would be at the back of it. I might be completely wrong, but when I've gone through the Ducati World Superbikes over the years, I can only find one bike that has a number 1 with a seat unit like this, and that was James Toseland's World Superbike. But I'm really pushing the boat out with that, but with this one, I've managed to find the exact motorcycle. Earlier I mentioned Virginio Ferrari's motorcycle, and it was only when I was researching it, I think I was able to find the exact photo of this bike on the internet before it was sold to this collection. After hours and hours of searching, I stumbled across Graziano Rossi riding a bike in similar colours. I think that was then in 1980 Virginio Ferrari's bike, and these photos are found online of the bike being signed, which I presume it was then sold after this point. Now this bike looks absolutely immaculate in these pictures, and the ones in the warehouse also look absolutely immaculate. So I'm 99% certain that bike in the warehouse is this bike here that we saw before it was sold or moved on to Italy. But I honestly think we're just scratching the surface with all the motorcycles that are at the front of this collection. If all those at the back are genuine World Superbikes or similar bikes to that, or there could even be the odd MotoGP bike thrown in there if I'm getting really giddy, there's no end to what this collection could have at the back. I've done my best to count the motorcycles in the photo, and I'm sure I can only count 59. And the article says that 62 motorcycles were seized, so perhaps there's another 3 lurking about somewhere else too. But this isn't just one lucky find, it's multiple modern bikes, multiple eras, multiple icons, which begs the core question, how have they even assembled this? Because whoever's behind this or whatever they've done, we put that to one side, whoever's assembled this collection of motorbikes has done an incredible job. I've never seen such a different array of motorbikes from so many different eras, and it's actually mind-blowing what's just been stored in a warehouse in Mexico. Now, whenever a story like this comes to the internet, it's very easy for people to sit there and think they're replicas or they're fakes or they're just random bikes that someone's built. And you can definitely say that for some of these bikes here. I'm pretty sure that Rossi bike, the 125, isn't a legitimate bike. I actually asked Michael Rutter because I thought I'd seen Tony Rutter's bike in there, who famously rode that at the Isle of Man TT. But when I looked up close, that was actually just a road bike that had been put there and wasn't actually the real race bike. So definitely within that collection, there are some bikes that aren't real race bikes, which also goes back to the original part of this story, is the value of them. Now, the FBI have valued this collection at $40 million. But honestly, I don't think it's actually possible to build these MotoGP bikes as fakes. I don't know how you'd even start to build one of those. So to me, those bikes are real. I'm pretty sure they're genuine Rossi MotoGP bikes, and there's 3 of them sat there. For me personally, I think it's impossible to put a price on this because I don't know how much these bikes would go for at auction. Perhaps they will now go to an auction and we'll see the true value of this collection. But then in all of this, it begs the question, why collect MotoGP bikes in the first place? Now, allegedly, when you go through this case, Ryan Wedding has had lots of different ways of trying to hide his money, whether it was the one-off rare Mercedes or cryptocurrency or lots of different ways of doing it. And in every Netflix documentary I've ever watched on this subject, that always becomes the hardest part, is hiding the bags of cash that they amass. So really, hiding MotoGP bikes in a vault seemed like quite a sensible thing to do. Relative to their size, they're quite small in the amount that you can carry in one place. And I would imagine in his mind, if things went south, allegedly, then these bikes could vanish all over the place into lots of different people's houses and still store some of your net worth. But then that actually got me thinking about this whole case, in that if this amount of bikes were hidden in Mexico, what else is hidden in the motorsport world? And what other things do we not know about bikes being hidden around the world? I hope you enjoyed the research I did into this video. If you did, please like the video and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.